Good morning, everyone. Those who attended episode 1 of the webinar series already know me. My name is Agnes Seri, and I'm the Deputy Head of the Capacity Building and Training Department of the Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI, which is based in Tokyo. Welcome to the second episode of our webinar series entitled The Economics of Climate Change, How to Climate-Proof Economies and Public Finance. This series focuses on the climate-related transmission channels which affect economies and public finance. It also focuses on the economic and financial tools available to policymakers to address the climate emergency. With this new knowledge project, we hope to improve general understanding of the economic and financial aspect of climate change. We hope to recommend economic and financial solutions useful for policymakers to build resilient and low-carbon economies. And we hope to strengthen developing countries' capacities to design climate strategies and align this with national budget processes and investment plans. The first episode focused on promoting climate change adaptation with fiscal policies, and it is available online. Today's episode will focus on identifying and responding to climate-related sovereign risk. Let me now invite the ADB Institute CEO, Dean Sonobe, to welcome you and introduce the theme of this first episode. Dean Sonobe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agnes. Good morning, everyone. Earlier this morning, I sent a condolence message to a few of those Tanzanian students whose PhD dissertation I supervised. As their country lost many people last several days due to the heavy downpour, flash floods, and landslides. Just 2 months ago, northern India suffered a deadly glacial lake burst flood. We also remember that last year, devastating floods in Pakistan made a third of the country underwater. These are just a few examples of damages highly likely caused by the global warming or global boiling. Among countless climate-related disasters the world has experienced in recent past. So today, we will explore the linkage between climate-related disasters and the sovereign risks. The devastating floods in Pakistan killed more than 1,700 people, left 500,000 homeless, and cost about $30 billion US. Immediately after, Moody's revised Pakistan's sovereign credit rating by 1 notch to the credit risk status of CAA1 from B3, citing the impoverished nation's decreasing foreign exchange reserves facing Pakistan's economy in the bruising aftermath of the deadly floods. So strictly speaking, sovereign risk refers to the probability that a country cannot pay its debt. But this probability is affected by or related to fiscal balance, public and private debts, gaps between investment needs and finance, exchange rates and interest rates, among many other things in a very complex manner. The concept of sovereign risk encompasses this complexity. Sovereign risk is, of course, related with debt sustainability and the climate risk through a range of transmission channels. Today, we will focus on these transmission channels to better understand them. I'm delighted that this webinar has 3 excellent experts who are kindly sharing with us their knowledge, experiences, and views about the nexuses and the necessary policies. Agnes, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Sonobe. Indeed, understanding these transmission channels and mitigating these risks are critical to ensure that countries which are the most exposed to climate change, and by the way, who are also the ones that have the greatest need for resilient investment, can get access to finance at an affordable cost. Now, I'm very happy to introduce our panelists. Let me start with John Byrne. All the bios are available on our event page, but let me highlight the following. John, you are the Vice Chair of Research at ADBI, and you are a macroeconomist. You worked a decade at the European Central Bank, and your research focuses on international macroeconomics, financial economics, and applied econometrics. Today, building on a research started in 2020, you will present to us the main transmission channels from climate risk to sovereign risk. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Agnes, for the introduction. So I have 10 minutes to discuss this issue on the transmission channels from climate risks to sovereign risk. This will be based on work that we carried out at ADBI in the years before the pandemic. And now, of course, fiscal capacities are much more constrained. So this issue is even more important for many of the economies that are affected by climate change. Please go to the next slide, Derek. So on this slide, which is taken from the book that we published in 2020, we highlight the main sort of transmission channels from climate change to sovereign risk across both physical and transition impacts of climate change through to sovereign risk, which we're really talking about in terms of the cost of sovereign borrowing. So running down through each of the topics in the middle of the slide, we can see that obviously a depletion of natural capital and natural services that come with deteriorating effects of climate change can impact the effect on potential output of the economy. And this can increase country risk with spillovers to sovereign risk and the cost of sovereign borrowing. There are obvious fiscal impacts of climate-related disasters. It entails significant fiscal expenditures to restore infrastructure and so on. And this can obviously impact the expenditure side and also have a longer term impact on potential output. And as a result of that, it can lead to problems in terms of raising the cost of sovereign borrowing if investors feel that there are additional country-specific vulnerabilities related to climate change that can affect the outlook for the economy going forward. And that leads to the third point, which is on fiscal consequences of adaptation and mitigation. Obviously, adaptation and mitigation policies are very important, but there are fiscal consequences related to those types of policies. So it will be important to channel fiscal resources to the most effective use in order to mitigate some of the impacts that could have on sovereign risk and the cost of sovereign borrowing. Macro impacts of climate change, I think, these are very clear. Climate change can have significant detrimental effects on the economy through affecting supply chains, through affecting infrastructure, as I already mentioned. And this can really hurt businesses in the area, and as a result of that can reduce economic activity, and there can be some longer term effects as well. So it really underscores the importance of mitigation and adaptation in particular as a policy response. Climate-related risks and financial sector stability is also an important consideration. As we have seen in recent years, central banks have become very interested in the impacts of climate change insofar as it affects not only price stability, but also financial stability. And as a result of climate change, there can be impacts on non-performing loans, which can spill over to asset prices and have an effect on sovereign risk through this channel. Related to that somewhat is the impacts of climate change on international trade and capital flows. So in a scenario of exacerbated climate change impacts, there could be negative effects in international markets should it lead to withdrawal of capital and impacts on asset prices, including bond yields as a result of that. And also there's some research to show that political stability is an important consideration as well. And obviously, when we talk about impacts on political stability, there are natural consequences for country risk and sovereign risk, and by extension, the cost of sovereign borrowing can be affected as a result of that. So that's sort of a higher level overview of the key transmission channels. One can go into much more detail, of course. The link is provided on the slides to the book, which is a few hundred pages long, which goes into detail on all of these issues. Given the limited time, I don't have sufficient availability of time to go through all of these, but they would be the main transmission channels. If we can go to the next slide, please, Derek, I will talk a little bit about some of the impacts empirically on climate risk on sovereign bond yields. So this is taken from research that was carried out in 2021, the sources on the bottom. On the left-hand panel, we have just a basic look at the data in terms of the relationship between sovereign bond yields for a sample of 40 economies and climate vulnerability as measured by the ND gain index. And what we can see is that there's a positive relationship between the basic correlation between sovereign bond yields and climate vulnerability, implying that as climate vulnerability would increase, we would observe some increase in the cost of sovereign borrowing. Of course, there's no causality there, which brings me to the other part of the slide on the right-hand panel. On the right-hand panel, this is based on econometric technique, which allows us to infer some causality from climate vulnerability to sovereign bond yields. Now, what we did here is we zoomed in on the economies that were deemed to be high risk. So those economies that have high vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And for those economies, we can see that there is a significant impact on their sovereign bond yields as a result of climate shocks. And these impacts persist over some time. So we're talking about quarters here on the horizontal axis, and basically the effect persists up until 18 quarters after the initial shock, which is obviously a significant amount of time. So the top half of the panel looks at the response of bond yields to climate vulnerability shocks. So this is where we see the positive impact. So in other words, worsening climate change, worsening impact on the cost of sovereign borrowing. On the bottom panel, we look at the impact of resilience on sovereign bond yields. So this is looking at the picture from a different angle. So if economies can invest in resilience through adaptation, through mitigation, then what would be the effect on sovereign bond yields? And here we see the negative effect. So it implies that as economies would become more resilient to climate vulnerability, there should be some dampening effect on the cost of sovereign borrowing, thereby improving the outlook for sovereign risk. Next slide, please. So in summary, this is very brief, I understand, but in summary, what would be the key policy implications? This derives from the work that I've discussed in the previous two slides. So the first would be to ensure that economies have in place a comprehensive vulnerability assessment that incorporates climate risk into national adaptation plans. Now, there has been a lot of work done on this issue in recent years, but I still think that there are gaps in data which make accuracy in these vulnerability assessments quite difficult. So there's still a lot of work to do there. I think the framework is in place, but more work is needed on the data. Mainstreaming climate risk analysis into the management of public finance is critical. It's ever more important now, given the constrained fiscal capacities due to the pandemic, for example. Again, like the first point, there has been significant work done in this area, particularly for economies that are highly vulnerable to climate change. But I think more can be done, and a regional approach can be important for sharing best practice in that regard. Third point would be on the adjustment of monetary and prudential frameworks and monetary policy operational frameworks to account for climate risks. I think the work of the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, has been an important factor which has pushed forward this point significantly. Central banks, as I said earlier, are very interested in understanding the impacts of climate change on the economy in terms of its impact on price stability and financial stability. So I think there has been work done there by central banks, but I think more central banks can be involved in this type of analysis, whereby climate risk is factored into their monetary policy operational framework and decision-making processes. Fourth point is very important. I think obviously there are limits to what public policy can do on adaptation and mitigation. So going forward, it will be important to scale up investment by the private sector and engage the financial sector in supporting these objectives towards sustainable finance and sustainable development over the longer term. There can be important roles to be played even by fintech, for example, in developing insurance solutions for the private sector. There can be important considerations related to blended finance, risk sharing, these types of issues. At the moment, we face the challenge of scalability. So whilst there are impacts at the project level, we need to really scale up those types of effects, and that's something that the MDBs, for example, are looking at going forward. And the final point would be on the role of regional cooperation and international financial support. Now, this cuts across numerous different facets. Obviously, supply chain diversification, expanding the energy supply network is very important. Decarbonization is key. But I think that knowledge transfer, sharing best practice will be important, and the international financial institution community can play an important role there, as well as on direct finance provision. And I'm talking here more about grants, particularly for those economies that are severely impacted by the effects of climate change. And as Agnes alluded to earlier, these are the economies that are most in need of investment and adaptation. And yet, as I've shown in the empirical work, these are the economies that face the most significant premia on their sovereign bond yields. So I think the international community has an important role to play going forward. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Indeed, being aware of all those transmission channels is key for policymakers trying to contribute and build climate resilience. And also the policy recommendations you highlighted are extremely useful, and we will go a little bit deeper later during this webinar. Now, moving to our second panelist, I'm delighted to welcome Louis Krauss, who is Chief Economist Asia Pacific at Standard & Poor's Global Rating. Standard & Poor's is, of course, one of the main rating agencies. It rates countries, and ratings are used to determine the country's cost of borrowing in international markets. Louis, you developed the macroeconomic forecast and risk scenario used during the rating process. We have, with John, we have started to focus on the main transmission channels from climate risk to sovereign risk. Now, let's continue with you from the perspective of a rating agency. Can you explain to us how climate vulnerability is factored into country risk assessment? Louis, over to you.
Thank you, Agnes, and thanks also for inviting me. It's a pleasure. So I'll be speaking on behalf of my colleagues. I'm not involved myself in doing sovereign rating, but I talk a lot to our team, and I also talked with them to understand better, how they actually factor in the various types of climate risks in their sovereign rating analysis and in their framework, which, as I also should highlight, is a work in progress, in the sense that this framework continues to be adjusted, updated as we learn more about the impact. And I will later also explain, I will read out a paragraph which I think is very important to indicate how is it exactly that they are factoring in this, and what are the limitations to that. So I should emphasize, this is This is our framework. I cannot speak on behalf of other credit rating agencies. So next slide, please. So I thought I'd start with giving you an idea of more generally, this is not about climate risk specifically, but how do our colleagues, what do they factor in there? What's their framework for coming up with their credit ratings, which, as John reminded us before, is about the ability, no, it was Agnes, well, one of you. It's about the ability of governments to repay their debt, right? That is what we are looking at in sovereign rating. And so our colleagues have 5 pillars. They look at the institutional assessments. They look at what they call the economic assessment, which is really about economic activity and growth, GDP growth, all that kind of stuff. They have an external pillar, which is about how, how are things looking in terms of the outlook for external deficits, exports, imports, these kind of things, exchange rate. There is a very important fiscal pillar, of course, about the government, which is about the outlook for revenues and expenditures that John also touched on. And there is a monetary assessment. And we generally, the way that we portray the link between climate and the general framework is that it is especially touching the 3 central pillars. There are indirect effects, like it could be, as John indicated, that political upheaval related to climate change may affect, the ability of a government to actually carry out policies, and that would affect the first pillar. But it's really about these 3 central pillars: growth, the external side, and the government itself. And of course, many, there are, when we think about how the climate is affecting economies, we know that, from newspaper reports, we know about the very acute types of events that can hit a government, like, a tsunami or something like that. And there are more sleeping is not the right word, like chronic events. They're not even a risk, but because they're actually happening. But if we think about the rise in temperature and how that affects agricultural yields and things like that, that is a longer term impact that is, that you read less about in the newspaper, but it has an impact anyway, and we need to make sure that we capture that. Next slide, please. And so we have those different types of risks, and I will get to the second one, but I'll start with the first one, which is really what in the literature people refer to as the physical risks. I mentioned they can be chronic or acute. These are all the things that you would be familiar with. Both what I mentioned, these longer term impacts on gradually rising sea levels, or gradually rising temperatures and what it does to agricultural yields, or not being able to ski anymore in Switzerland, which is affecting the economy over there. But so I want to read out that paragraph in italics, which our colleagues emphasize is what they are, how they are looking at this. We want to incorporate those adverse physical effects of climate change in our credit ratings. We need to, we do that together with many other types of impacts and events. And so, Agnes, you had a question, is there, can you give us examples of where climate change risks or climate change events have actually affected a change in sovereign rating? And unfortunate, or well, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, when I ask my colleagues, that has not yet happened. And I think one of the reasons is that there are so many things that are if you think about, say, the Indian economy, we've had some really major climate events happening in India, but we're also having a booming economy, which is helping the government. And so the impact of the climate events and climate risks are coming alongside many other types of events that our colleagues are looking at. And therefore, I'm not saying that it has no impact, but we need to put the impact together with many other kind of things. Another issue, of course, is that it has to be material and visible. And I mentioned how this is a work in progress. I think we are increasingly learning and being able to measure the impact of the climate. And so I think our framework is over time becoming more accurate, more sensitive, picking up impacts that we didn't do a few years ago. And so this, again, this is a evolving framework in that sense. Next slide, please. So I mentioned initially those physical risks, right? How is the climate affecting our economies and our populations and the way that these populations interact with the economy? A second very important type of ways in which climate-related issues can affect the economy is as societies or governments are trying to move away from fossil fuels or are making other changes. And of course, these changes can be absolutely crucial and very important and totally right, but when we as hard-nosed credit rating people have to look at what could be the impact of those changes on the economy, on exports, or on the government. So for instance, if a fossil fuel exporting economy is trying to move away from fossil fuels, that will have an impact on its economy, on its economic growth, and on its government. So we would have to, other things being equal, we would have to put that as a minus in terms of our credit rating, even if we may, as people, be extremely in favor of such a move. So these transition risks are actually encompassing quite a number of different types of things, if you think about it. Like, because we are seeing climate policy becoming a very important part of overall economic policy. We are having all kinds of legal, technological, and other issues related to these changes that societies and people and governments are making. And so I think personally, I think that increasingly we have to be very watchful and make sure that we capture also those transition risks, because it would be wrong for us to, well, so what I think what I'm trying to say is that almost all of us are highly in favor of moving away, putting our planet on a sustainable footing with regard to the climate. But as hard-nosed credit rating people, our colleagues have to continue to be focused on what does this mean for the ability of the government to repay its debt, and that is in principle quite a different analysis. So next slide, please. But so, John already mentioned, and there are, of course, I'm not going to go in too much detail. I think everybody can picture all these different types of ways in which the climate is affecting the economy. Next slide, please, because I want to zoom in a bit on more of the specific. And of course, there have been, I mentioned before, like in the case of the acute risks or acute events happening, we have definitely already made changes to sovereign outlooks. And I think another point to make, Agnes, in terms of your question as to what extent, has it been the case that our colleagues have changed the sovereign rating as a result of climate change aspect? I would say that is more likely to happen with regard to, say, specific companies than in the case of a country. And as you can see over here as well, the kind of countries or provinces whose ratings may be affected by climate change tend to be ones that are small, that whose economies are not very, whose economies may depend on specific types of resources or activities, are not well hedged, if you want. And so, and that of course that gives you an indication that for, say, a large economy like China, Indonesia, it becomes a bit less likely that its government is not going to be able to repay its debt because of something happening in a province of Indonesia. Next slide, please. But so our colleagues have tried to map really the sensitivity, the vulnerability of different countries in relation to the different types of climate risk. And they have done that with regard to, say, the structure of the economy, and also looking at the labor force in terms of how the labor force is affected. And next slide, please, because I want to indicate a little bit how that would look for different kinds of economies in that, in such a mapping. And you, of course, when you think about temperature and heat waves, there are quite a few economies in our region, unfortunately, that are heavily affected by this. And I think it's also, again, coming back to that classification between acute risks and more chronic events happening. So you could be exposed to temperature-related issues by means of a heat wave, but you are exposed to temperature if your temperature is gradually rising. And one thing that we have incorporated in our longer-term growth outlooks is that long-term impact of temperature increases, what it does to economic growth. We know from research that impact is quite significant, and unfortunately, it is especially significant in economies where the temperature is already high. In fact, these studies suggest that in cold countries, the impact may actually be a little bit positive. But so, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of cold countries in our region. Almost all the economies in our region are already, have temperatures higher than 14, 15 degrees on average, and are affected by these chronic effects. In addition to that, there are these heat wave types of things. There are other types of factors that our colleagues include in this analysis. They have to do with water stress, drought, flooding. They also have to do with seawater level increases. They also look at wildfires, floods, these types of things, and then they come up with a bit of a mapping. I live in one of the most vulnerable economies, unfortunately. Hong Kong is hot. It is exposed to seawater and storm floods. We actually increasingly have had typhoon warnings and storm warnings when in Hong Kong pretty much the whole economy closes down. So that is a pretty obvious impact that we are seeing. So Hong Kong is rated quite so these economies are ranked by that column where it says total GDP exposure, which of course indicates that Fiji, Hong Kong, for obvious reasons, are very vulnerable. With an economy like New Zealand, you may think it's all the way out there by itself, but actually on these measures, apparently is not all that vulnerable to these climate changes. Now, there is a first column, which is the readiness assessment, which of course is very important as well. John touched on that. So it is one thing to be vulnerable to the climate. It is another issue how well prepared you are. That preparedness will improve the better that you as a government have done your homework in terms of mitigation, preparedness, and things like that. And so that is something that my colleagues are looking at as well. Next slide, please. So this is simply just a geographical representation of these impacts. I really just show this to indicate that there is a lot of background work going on in our company to make sure that we keep abreast of these climate-related changes, even if you as a consumer, as a user of our ratings, may not see a credit rating being changed as a result of a climate event or a climate risk. Next slide, please. I think there's one more slide. So this is actually next slide, please, because I wanted to close on this point that when we look at the vulnerability of different economies, also either across the globe or within our region, certain economies, as I already showed, are more sensitive. Generally speaking, if you put everything together, our colleagues find that South Asia is most exposed to climate risks if you add up the temperature-related issues together with the other ones. And so that's a little bit, I wanted to give you a bit of a feeling, and I'm happy to talk more, in our discussion on that link between climate events and sovereign rating. Back to you, Anja.
Thank you very much, Louis. So now we are focused on the multiple transmission channels from climate risks to sovereign risk. Let's look at how to mitigate these risks. Our third panelist is Emma Fan. Emma, you are director of the newly created Finance Sector Office within the Sectors Group of the Asian Development Bank. You lead the team that covers the East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Pacific operations. Emma, the audience has now a better understanding of the linkages between climate change and sovereign risk. Working in a multilateral development bank, how can countries be supported to mitigate the adverse impact of climate change risks? And what kinds of solutions do you offer to meet the financing needs of countries whose sovereign risk may be strongly affected by physical risk and also transition risk? Emma, over to you.
Agnes, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to present here. And I also truly enjoyed John's and Louis' presentation. As we know, climate change really exerts existential risks for humanity. This things now is already beyond dispute. And John and Louis' presentations have really provided us with great insights on the transition risks, on the physical risks. So I will not go through that, but on the impact of sovereign risks from where I'm sitting in the finance sector of ADB, we really focus on two key risks. One is the impact of the climate change on public finance. You know, how the revenues, expenditures will change with climate change, and the government's responsibilities in the face of major disasters, even for public asset, even for private asset, because sometimes the government is called the insurer of the last resort. And then another aspect we are really focused on is the impact on the financial systems, on the banks, non-bank financial institutions, capital markets, and so on, and the financial stability as a whole. So while we recognize the major impact from climate change, we also know the world needs huge amount of finance to help us to transit into a net zero economy and to improve our resilience and adaptation. According to a study by McKinsey in last year, the world needs needs about $9.2 trillion from about now to 2050 to help us to transit into a net zero situation. And such investment also needs to be front-loaded, because the more delays we have, the more damage we will do. So it's not just all doom gloom. There are also opportunities. With us really strive to tackle climate change, there are also opportunities to improve resource efficiency, have better energy sources, develop our markets, and strengthen our overall resilience. And there are huge public goods and positive externalities from our efforts, as such that the benefits go beyond national borders. So there's really a strong case for us to work together. On the other hand, climate finance also faces major challenges. We know such investments generally are perceived as having higher risks, lower returns, longer payback period. It's precisely due to their public goods nature and positive externalities. What's available in the market generally tend to be shorter term, not sufficient amount. Project sponsors are not familiar with such finance, and capital markets are also underdeveloped. So governments and MDBs really need to play a strong role to enable the market development and crowding in private investment. In such a context, ADB has committed to be the region's climate bank. We have set a clear climate investment target from 2019 to 2030 at $100 billion. And we have mainstreamed climate scoring and into all our operations. Last year, ADB approved $7.1 billion in climate finance. And just recently, we have adopted a comprehensive climate change action plan. So let me now, the one instrument we really use to help mitigate the climate risks, including sovereign risks, is through our operations. And I will share a few examples of our operations. In the first one is the Shandong Green Development Fund project. This is the first provincial level climate fund that ADB helped to establish. We know Shandong has over 100 million population. It's an industrial hub and heavily polluted. So with 100 million from ADB, we help to leverage $300 million from other sources. And this is the one and only project in the PRC that has secured the GCF funding of 100 million. So leveraging, crowding in is a key objective of this project. Through different levels of leverage, we hope that at the fund level, at the project level, the investment can reach $7.5 billion. On top of finance, we want to help with the institutional development. We helped Shandong to develop a comprehensive climate investment framework based on the GCF frameworks. We also introduced the professional fund management, which is very different from traditional government fund management. Moving to South Asia, I want to share an example of a multi-tranche financing facility, 500 million, which was provided to the India Renewable Energy Development Agency. So again, through this working with this non-bank financial institution, we want to promote energy transition across India and use ADB's long-term finance to crowd in private sector finance and develop a stream of renewable energy project. And then let's move to the Pacific. Currently, we are preparing a grant facility of $10 million, really to go through development banks in multiple Pacific countries to finance affordable energy projects. One innovation of this project is this really the regional approach, because we know in the Pacific, countries are very small, transactions are very small. As such, the transaction costs can be very high. So through the regional approach, we can reduce the unit cost, the transaction cost. And another feature of this project is really to promote inclusion and support the access to energy by the poor, low-income households, and women. So we try to strengthen the nexus between climate change and inclusion. And then the first three examples I introduced about belongs to our investment project category. Recently, we also have introduced a new approach, which is climate change policy-based loans. This is really to support policy, regulatory, legal framework changes through general budget support. The first one of such programs is for the Philippines, which was approved last year. It's about $422 million, co-funded by ADB and the French AFD. So the objective is really to support the whole spectrum of national climate policies, including the national determined contributions, and help the Philippines to transit to net zero, to carbon peaking by about 2030. So we target multiple sectors, including adaptation, vulnerable sectors, agriculture, natural resources, and the environment, and emission-intensive sectors, energy and transport. So currently we're preparing multiple similar projects and programs in other countries. I talked about investment operations, policy-based operations. Another major instrument we have, of course, is technical assistance. Here, I want to share the example that we have provided to the 10 ASEAN member countries, to the regulators, for them to support the transition and the climate finance. This TA was 177.5 million grant implemented from 2019. It's continuing. I just want to share a few achievements under this TA. So through this support, the ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance was adopted this year. ASEAN transition finance guidance was adopted this year, and also ASEAN corporate governance scorecard. So these are just some of the recent achievements. We also helped to introduce the International Sustainability Standard Board to conduct training on the ISSB standards to ASEAN regulators just recently. So finally, I want to share a TA in Kazakhstan. This one is really to help Kazakhstan's housing company to move into green housing through adopting strategies, different technology development, finance and risk management approaches, really to improve through the housing programs to save energy consumption, water consumption, use more climate resilient and friendly building materials. So those are some of the investment level examples. Of course, we also have numerous corporate level efforts. ADB's energy transition mechanism is very well known for its efforts to retire coal-powered plant, the coal-fired power plants. We have large financing facilities such as the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, Asia Pacific Climate Finance Funds, which are used to reduce cost of capital and de-risk green projects. We have ADB Ventures, ADB Frontiers to support bold technologies in startup companies, especially small SMEs, and also in frontier countries, which generally tend to be the smaller countries. And then we have the project development facility really to help to prepare projects, especially PPP projects. So ADB is only one player in the big and the large scale of challenges we are facing. So we try to really support efforts beyond just the ADB finance. One is through leverage. For every dollar from ADB, we expect that we could leverage multiple dollars from other sources. In addition to the financing, we also want to promote market development through developing products, instruments, green investment lines. We have multiple such examples, which I can share if we have other opportunities. We want to demonstrate ways of innovation to help replication and crowd in other players. And then we want our countries and entities so clients to adopt the international best practices, for example, in the areas of taxonomies, ESG, circular economies, safeguards, and gender. And through this, we want to really achieve our strategy 2030's agenda of providing finance plus. The plus means partnerships and knowledge solutions. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Emma, for sharing such a comprehensive strategy with useful, innovative instruments to either support implementation of relevant national strategies, or also strengthen financial sector in countries, and also mobilize resources to face those huge financing needs in countries, and all of those components when targeted at scale, which of course contribute to build a robust sovereign position. So now we have a few minutes left for our panel discussion. I have a question for John. John, to ensure our audience understands the magnitude of the adverse impact of climate risks on borrowing costs, could you share with us the result of your empirical research? To what extent the cost of sovereign borrowing is more expensive when a country is exposed to climate risks?
Okay, Agnes, yes, thanks for this question. I think, there are obviously going to be different responses of or to the cost of sovereign borrowing, depending on the extent to which the economy is exposed to climate change. So in our study, we looked at a large sample of 40 economies which had different degrees of exposure to climate change. And what we found was for those economies that were deemed most at risk to climate change, they faced the highest premium on sovereign bond yields. And the number or the extent of that premium amounted to around 275 basis points. So if you can look at that in the context of where bond yields are at the moment, for example, if we look at Thailand or Vietnam, they're at about the 3% level. So what our research shows is that, you know, exposure to climate change could actually double the cost of sovereign borrowing for some economies. It depends, of course, where their prevailing cost lies. For economies that are less exposed, the impact on the sovereign risk is obviously less, but it's still significant. On resilience, I mentioned resilience. If I can just briefly talk about that for a minute. Resilience can help to dampen the effect on the cost of sovereign borrowing, but the extent of this is much less than the impact on vulnerability. So vulnerability matters a lot more for sovereign bond yields. And the reason for this, we posit, is that, you know, financial markets are pricing vulnerability more so than they would resilient. It's similar to the way we see markets reacting in financial crisis times. So they punish more the bad news than reward the good news. And there's also difficulties, of course, in pricing resilience due to data constraints. But yeah, I would say that, you know, there are significant costs in terms of the climate risk component, and it can be around 300 basis points.
Thank you very much, John. This is actually linked to the question I would like to ask to Louis, because Louis, you mentioned that climate actions do not necessarily mechanically improve the country rating. And it was observed, you observed that, or when you discussed also with the teams in charge of providing the country rating, because there are other factors playing in this assessment. But conversely, I wanted to ask you if you have already seen the case of a country with no significant action to be more climate resilient, seeing its rating more downgraded than others, all things being equal. I'm wondering if there is for example, a small country where such an assessment took place in your experience.
Yeah, Agnes, that is a good question. I understand that even that has not happened, but let me give a little bit more color as to why that is. I think, you know, I mentioned, right, so we have these, when you think about a downgrade, you move from one bucket to another bucket.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And you know, when I say that we haven't observed that a climate related factor drives such a move from one bucket to the other, that doesn't mean that we are not seeing the impact of these factors. It's just that they have not yet led us to move a country from one bucket to the other. And I think one additional reason why that is that if you look at the kind of economies that we rate, we actually do not rate many of these very small economies. If you look in our region, in the APAC region, the Cook Islands is an economy that we rate. There's an interesting reason for that. That is done on behalf. Basically, we're asked by the New Zealand government to do that. It's part of their governance arrangement related to financing flows. But so other than that, we don't rate some of the most vulnerable, like the most, I would argue, the most vulnerable economies in the Pacific, we actually do not rate. And that is another reason why we may not yet have observed it, even though I completely understand your question. And I do not want to give our audience the impression that we are not factoring in those changes. It just, they have not yet been large enough to throw one country from one bucket to another bucket.
Yes, and sometimes I guess it takes some time to such an event takes some time to reflect in many components of the economy of a country. And what you are sharing with us, I guess, emphasize the intricacies among all components and the complexity of those transmission channels. And of course, it doesn't mean that doing nothing or building resilience will not protect more a country, of course.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you, Louis. Emma, let me ask the final question to you. You shared concrete examples on green financing, and I think it was extremely useful for our audience. Could you share additional information about innovative blue financing and explain the extent to which it can be a relevant solution for some countries highly vulnerable to climate change in order to preserve their sovereign risk?
Yes, absolutely. This is an excellent question. The vulnerability is not limited to land, right? Ocean shelter 80% of all life forms on Earth. So blue finance is a very important, and it is actually the part of the large architecture on the green finance. But our understanding and the development, I think, is not as mature as the green finance part. Yet significant progress has been made. So in ADBI, we have a Healthy Oceans program, which we allocated $5 billion from 2019 to 2024 for 5 years. And yesterday, I actually joined the launch event to launch the Blue Bond guidelines for the Philippines. And so we have also investment operations. For example, in China, together with IFC, Proparco, DEG, we have provided a syndicated loan, blue loan, to really help to protect the ocean's ecosystems, but also better use ocean resources and develop the blue economy. So the ocean is very important from an economic perspective, from a climate perspective, from an environmental perspective. It really forms an integral part of the resilience story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. So it's now time to close this second episode. I want to sincerely thank our panelists for sharing knowledge as well as experiences to better understand how climate risk can adversely impact a country's sovereign risk, and how building climate resilience can play a positive role while vulnerability or keeping vulnerability can actually worsen the country's situation. So understanding this relationship is important because, as we highlighted before, it reduces investment capacities of countries. While countries' financing needs to respond to the climate emergency are huge and continue to grow. As a conclusion, let me highlight 4 key policy recommendations already highlighted by Emma and John, but I think it's important to insist on them to build climate resilience. So the first one is that to build climate resilience and preserve the sovereign situation, governments need to conduct comprehensive climate vulnerability assessments and develop national adaptation plans to climate-proof their economies and public finance. So this is a major starting point. Second, governments need to mainstream climate risk analysis in public financial management. And here I'm referring to budgeting process, utilization of debt instruments, and also revenue source diversification. It's really critical. Third, and John made this point, central banks and financial supervisors needs to support governments in analyzing macro-financial risks arising from climate change and to address climate-related risks in their monetary and prudential frameworks and operations. This was also highlighted by Emma. This is a major component. And finally, governments and financial authorities should implement financial sector policies to scale up investment in climate adaptation and resilience and develop insurance solutions. This was also a point made by John and Emma, and I personally think it's also very critical. It's now time to close this session. Thank you again for joining episode 2 of the webinar series on the economics of climate change. The recording will be uploaded on the event webpage shortly. Please also take a few moments to complete our post-event survey. We look forward to welcoming you at the following episodes and also future ADBI events. See you in January for our 3rd episode. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.